Okay, so thank you again for joining us for today's topic, Employing Metrics for Effective Course Corrections. As I was looking at the registration for this course, I thought it was really interesting. We try to offer webinars through the Osborne group about every 2 or 3 months and announce them on our constant contact emails that we send out and through various social media outlets. What I thought was interesting as I looked at the last few webinars that we have had about 45 to 60 registrants for any given topic. We had 85 register for our topic today, and I thought that was interesting and encouraging that this is a topic that people really find relevant, something that's really important to you, hopefully something that you're hoping to expand upon and do a little bit more of. So hopefully we'll have a chance to go through some different issues, challenges, topics today, and I'm hoping that you'll all walk away with some really useful information that you can go back and implement right away that will actually help you make some real change and real difference in your programs. So why do we need to make course corrections? Why is this even something that we're talking about? The reality is that planning and evaluation are critical to our success, but too often planning and evaluation take a backseat to day-to-day deadlines, fires that need to put out. You all know what your days look like, and I think all of us who have been in the development field have times when we feel like we're running around like a chicken with our head cut off, just trying to put out fires and deal with the issues that are right in front of us. So when someone comes up to us and says, let's do a fund development plan, or let's talk about evaluation or strategy, you sometimes can feel like your head's going to pop off, because this feels like just one more thing to add to your enormous to-do list that already feels incredibly overwhelming. What I want to say to you today, and hopefully this is something that many of you already embrace, is that good planning and evaluation is actually the thing that's going to help you be able to manage your time more effectively, focus on the priorities that really make a difference, and help you to control some of those fires and be able to more readily deal with those fires as they come and you need to put them out. The reality, too, is that developing a fund development plan is really only half the battle. I can't tell you the number of organizations that I've worked with that go through the process of creating a really fantastic fund development plan only to then have it sit on a shelf. We talk about this a lot with planning, that too often we go through really rigorous planning processes. We come out with really great goals and objectives and strategies and measurements, and then we don't look at it again until the end of the year, which by then it's too late. As you can see on your screen, there are times when we get halfway or even 3/4 of the way through the year and realize that things are not going nearly the way that we planned. So what we want to be able to do is take a plan and then actually monitor it throughout the year with consistent measurements, consistent metrics that are going to help us to be able to make course corrections along the way. Now, for those of you who don't have a plan, don't stress. This is still totally relevant to you, and I hope that what you can do today is take some of this advice around developing metrics and around making course corrections and actually use this as a jumping off point to create a more detailed plan, to take some time to go into that more detailed planning process and create your fund development plan for the year. But in the meantime, let's at least take some of the lessons from 2014. You guys have gotten through the flurry of the end of the year. You have learned a lot of lessons at the end of the year about what your donors are responding to, about trends in giving to your organization, what's working, what's not working. Let's take those learnings. Let's look at what's ahead of us in 2015. This is a great time to make course corrections because we've gotten out of that flurry at the end of the year. We're about to head in to the craziness of our spring event season for most nonprofit organizations. So let's stop now, evaluate where we are, and make some course corrections before we move forward. And I want to really stress that this isn't just about setting a few goals or pulling a couple of reports. This is about creating culture. This is about creating a data-driven culture that uses data to drive your goals, drive your objectives, drive your strategies. We want to start with data. We want to always start with, what do we know about ourselves? What's our current state? And this isn't about making guesstimates. This is about really understanding who we are, where we are, and the reality of our development program. We can't make assumptions. That's part of what got us, part of the challenge that we have is that too often we just make assumptions about what's working and what's not working, and it leads us to continue with the same activities, doing the same things over and over again, sticking with the status quo. But by truly using data to understand where we are and what's working and what's not, we can actually use that data to drive our goals. Are we setting realistic goals? Are we setting objectives from the top down and the bottom up that make sense with the reality of our situation? Are we using data to create strategies? Are we doing strategies merely because they're what we've always done? Or are we conducting strategies because we know they are what makes sense for us? And then ultimately making sure that we are measuring the results of our goals, of our strategies, and then that's feeding back into that data loop. So how do we decide which metrics? Today we're going to talk about a lot of metrics. I'm going to go through a lot of different measurements, a lot of different tools you could be using to measure your fund development performance. And what I want you to realize is that this is not about me saying, do all of these things. This is not about me saying, here's a set of 100 metrics that you should be implementing in your organization. In fact, I would say I encourage you to do just the opposite. I think we have to be realistic about metrics. I think it's really tempting to see a list of metrics and say, man, wouldn't it be awesome if we could measure all of these things? Think about what we could do if we could measure all of these things. But we need to be able to start simply. We need to be able to focus on what's important and build a metrics system that works for us. We don't want to become so overwhelmed with metrics that we just throw up our hands and give up on the whole system. I think it's important to use your fund development plan as a guide. I mentioned this a little bit in the last slide, but I want to reiterate that as you develop your fund development plan, you should be incorporating metrics into that plan. You should be, every goal and objective and strategy and action item that you have in your fund development plan should be measured by a metric that's telling you whether or not this is successful. So ultimately, when you're deciding which metrics to use, they should be grounded in your fund development plan. And if you don't have a fund development plan, start thinking about, use today as a way to start thinking about which metrics you want to use, and then help that, again, jumpstart a broader, more detailed fund development planning process. Determine your gaps and challenges. I have been with the Osborne Group for about 1.5 years now, and during this transition period, going into consulting, there were often times when Karen or Bob Osborne would come to me and say, oh, what do you need, and what questions do you have? And I would kind of look at them with wide eyes and say, gosh, I don't know what I don't know. I have no idea what questions to even ask you. And I think a lot of times we can feel like that when it comes to metrics. We kind of look and say, gosh, I don't even know what questions I should be asking myself. But I want to challenge you to really think about what it is that you do know that you don't know. I think oftentimes if we were to sit down with our teams and brainstorm about the challenges that we have, most of us know exactly what it is that we aren't sure about, what those burning questions are, what those challenges are that we just can't quite figure out. The old saying is that you achieve what you measure. So think about what you want to be achieving, or what it is that you would like to be achieving that you're having trouble with or you're struggling achieving, and then figure out a way to measure that. So instead of starting with the metrics, start with what is it we're trying to achieve, and what are we having challenges with, and then develop your metrics based on that. I also like to use the what's keeping me up at night measure. And ultimately, for many of us in development, there are those things as you lay in bed in that moment before you fall asleep. There are those things that kind of are stressing us out. There's those questions that we have about progress. Am I going to reach a goal? I think so often the stress that we have around reaching our goals is not about our ability to reach the goals. We all have the ability to do what we need to do to reach our goals. I think a lot of the stress and a lot of what keeps us up at night about reaching our goals is about not knowing where we are. It's about not understanding and the uncertainty of where we stand. So think about those things that keep you up at night and find some metrics that are going to help you identify where you are. And then lastly, the bottom line with metrics is that you can only measure what you can measure. So, yes, it would be wonderful if I could have this really complex metric system and be looking at really complex donor metrics, except I'm only using spreadsheets. I don't have a donor database system. If that's your reality, live within your reality. Look at the systems that you have. Look at your database systems. Look at your management systems that you have and the ways that you have to collect data, to analyze data, and to ultimately monitor progress toward metrics, and create a system that works within that. If you decide that the system you have isn't good enough and you want to improve it, be realistic about what you can improve. So again, don't think that you can go from, a bicycle to a Corvette. Be realistic about the system that you can put in place to monitor your progress, to monitor your metrics. And remember that it's not just about getting things set up. It's not just about the initial setting the metrics and setting up the reports, but it's about being able to continually update the data, input the data, analyze it, monitor, and track it. So it's not only about, it's not just about bringing in an intern to set up the system for you, but it's about recognizing what resources you're going to need ongoing to monitor this metrics system. So again, create something that is doable, that's realistic for you, that's going to focus on the priorities that are most important, and ones that are going to make you feel good. Don't set up something that's going to be so overwhelming that you're just going to give up on it. You can always err on the side of starting simple and then building upon success when it comes to your metrics development. So metrics can be overwhelming. There are, I throughout the years have been I keep a running list. I keep a spreadsheet, a running list, as I am on webinars or as I read articles or as I'm in conversations with people, I go and I add metrics to this list. And I think at this point, the spreadsheet is probably, I would guess, about 80 lines long. It's about 80 different metrics that over time I've kind of, and some of them are not fully developed. Some of them are things that I've just been talking to people and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you could measure this? And that kind of goes on the metrics list. And when I look at that list, it's terribly overwhelming because I think, gosh, how do you even manage something like this? So what I like to do is put things within context and put things within a framework. What I have here is a framework for a fund development system. This is a 4-part framework that I like to use when I think about the key components of a comprehensive fund development program. And here you can see those 4 key components: having a consistent donor management model that all donors go through to ensure that you're building effective relationships and having consistent communication and processes for your donors, having a performance management system for your people to make sure that not only are you increasing retention and valuing your best people, but that you're also holding people accountable. Recognizing the importance of volunteer leadership, and this often means the board, but it can also mean other significant volunteers that help support you in your fundraising efforts. And then finally, systems and technology. Obviously, this is something that, all of the other stuff is great, but if we don't have really great systems and technology, then the other parts of the system kind of fall apart. So what I'm going to do today is go through some different metrics within the context of this fund development system, and I hope that this will give you all a sense of how you might start approaching deciding which metrics you want to use, which ones are going to be most relevant to you. As you look at these different areas, I think you're probably starting to get a sense of which areas you're already seeing gaps, or which areas you have some challenges in, and you know you want to create some metrics that are going to help you to achieve success. So let's start with the donor management model. And this here is a donor management model that I like to use. It's an 8-step model. You may have another model that you subscribe to. There are lots and lots of different donor management models and philosophies out there, but I would venture to guess that regardless of the donor management model that you use, it follows along somewhat closely to this model, that at least it could be whatever you're using within your donor database systems or within your organizations can be adapted pretty close to this. So as we go through this, it should be fairly adaptable to any model you might be using and relevant to what you're doing. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through each of these 8 steps and talk about a handful of metrics that I think are really useful within this. Now, I would recommend that you choose at least one metric for each of these 8 steps. And the reason I say that is because I think each of these 8 steps is critically important to your success. I don't think that there's any one of these steps that is less important. I think if you drop a ball along any of this, I think you run into challenges. So for that reason, I would say my recommendation is to pick a metric for each of these 8 steps. However, I say that with the caveat of what I said earlier, which is I also don't want you to start with so many metrics that you feel overwhelmed. So again, if you don't feel like you're in a place where you can choose 8 metrics around the donor management model, look at this model and think about where you're having challenges, where people are getting stuck, where maybe your team is not as strong, and choose some metrics in that area so that you can really assess your gaps and challenges as it relates to the way that we put donors through this donor management process. So let's start with identification. There are a lot of different things that we could measure when it comes to identification. There's a lot of really great research out there around new donor acquisition. I think there's definitely some cool things to look at, kind of benchmarking yourself against some national trends as it relates to acquisition. But what I want to focus on today, and the one tool that if I had a magic wand and I could make every development office in the world use one tool consistently, it would be a table of gifts. I think a table of gifts, when I was in the field and I was raising money, again, when I thought about what was keeping me up at night, the table of gifts was the one tool that I could say unequivocally was the thing that helped me sleep at night. A lot of you are familiar with the table of gifts, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but for those of you who are new to a table of gifts, it's basically a tool that allows us to say, here's our goal, here's the amount of money we need to raise, and given that, we need X number of gifts at various levels to reach that goal. Once we know how many gifts we need at different levels, that helps us identify the number of prospects. There's a lot of different rules of thumb. We typically say 3 to 4 prospects per gift are needed at each of the different levels. So once you've identified how many gifts you need at each of the different levels, you can now start to decide how many prospects you need. And why this is important is for really 2 main reasons. One is that part of making course corrections is about looking at your existing goals and making sure that they're achievable. I know that a lot of people kind of scoff at me when I say things like revising budget numbers or revenue numbers. I know that that's not always an option for you. I know that so often we get to mid-year, we get to 2/3 of the year, and we have a lot of stress about reaching our end-of-year revenue goals. And whether they are realistic or not, we don't always have a lot of control or say in whether or not those goals get revised. But I will say that at least a table of gifts gives you a sense of where you are, gives you a very concrete sense of your progress to that revenue goal, how far you've come, how far you have left, how many more gifts you need. You're able to share with your CEOs, you're able to share with board members exactly where you are in the reality of your financial situation. You're also, the second big reason that a table of gifts is really powerful is around identification, because at any given time, we're able to see how many prospects we still need. I think identification tends to be one of the areas that nonprofits struggle with the most. I think that we tend to do a lot of pipeline building activities that we don't take advantage of. I think we underestimate our pipelines and thus underestimate how many prospects we truly have. So I think that, creating a table of gifts and forcing yourself to look at your pipelines and pull the names out of those events, direct mail, different community events you're doing, all of those different things you're doing in the community to build pipeline, really taking all of that and putting it towards this list, I think, is a really useful activity. This is also a great tool to use with executive staff, with your development teams, and particularly with boards. Because often when we go to them and we say, I need a list of names. Can you give me a list of names to open some doors? It feels like a very vague request. People don't always know what we're asking them for. They don't always know the purpose. They don't always truly understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. But when we show up with a table of gifts that clearly outlines what we're trying to accomplish, how far we are along in reaching that goal, and what we still need to reach that goal, it becomes so much more clear and it becomes very concrete. Most of our board members tend to be concrete, so let's give them the data, give them the numbers that they need to help them understand what it is we're really asking them for. So again, I can't overemphasize the use of a table of gifts, and particularly using a table of gifts to really help you with identification and knowing where you are and knowing what you need. This is just a tiny excerpt from our table of gifts template. I'll provide my email address at the end of this. There are a few different resources I'm going to talk about in the course of this session, and if you're interested in getting the full templates, please just email me after this session. I'll be happy to share them with you. So let's move on to research. I think research is one of those areas that people either tend to have incredibly robust research functions or they have nothing. A lot of you there may be people on this call who are in smaller shops who have already started to tune me out as I talk about research, because you're saying to yourself, Laurel, I don't have research function. I'm a 1 or a 2-man shop. We just don't have the capacity to do this. But I will say, like I said when we started talking about the donor management model, every single one of these steps is critical to your success. I would say that even if you're in a small shop, you need to have some research functionality. What having metrics does for a small shop is it starts to help you identify what you do have capacity to do and what you don't, and how that's affecting the rest of your donor management process, and how it may be detrimentally affecting your ability to pull in major and principal gifts. So again, for those of you who are in bigger shops, I think even if you don't have a dedicated research function, I think it's important to make sure that that function is being covered, whether it's part of someone's role, whether it's part of several people's roles. I think setting some goals, these are just a few examples of the goals you might set or the metrics you might be looking at over time. How many donors have been rated. If you are interested in some capacity rating guidelines, that's another tool that I'm happy to share with you that we have. Once people have been rated, how many of them are getting research profiles? Some of these different things. So again, whether you're in a large shop or a small shop, I think you need to be looking at research, setting some goals, setting some benchmarks, and monitoring your progress toward it. So now let's move into the third step, which is donor planning and the donor plan. And I think this is one of those you won't see in a lot of other models that I actually really like pulling out as a distinct step, because I think too often we jump straight from research into engagement, and we tend to, some of us are pretty good about putting action steps into, if you have Razor's Edge, maybe you go in there and you put a couple action steps in there, maybe you keep a separate spreadsheet that tracks moves management, but I think not often enough are we actually stopping and doing written plans for our top major and principal gift prospects. Again, this is just an excerpt from our major gift strategy worksheet. This is a really great tool. Even if you keep this information in a separate database, I like this tool just as a check to make sure that we're keeping the right data sets and the right information on our donors in our databases. I think, again, when we're looking at donor planning metrics, what I want us to think about is, how many people are being assigned, first and foremost. For those of you who don't have major gift officers, for those of you who are in smaller shops, how many people are being assigned to a dedicated relationship manager, and that's in smaller shops, that's probably you. That's probably the CDO or the director of development, but it could also be the CEO. It could be board members who are serving as relationship managers. It could be the function if you have a program director who has some portion of their time dedicated to fund development. It could be them, but making sure that you have an expectation for how many people are being assigned. And then also, making sure that you have an expectation for the percentage of people who are getting written plans. I'm not saying it has to be 100%. I think the important thing when we think about metrics and about benchmarking is not that we're saying we're going to set goals that say this happens for everybody, but rather we set goals that say we have an expectation that 20%, 40%, whatever it is that feels realistic, that feels manageable to you, is going to happen. So again, I think making sure that you set these donor planning metrics. I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions. And yes, I will be happy to provide copies of the worksheets. Just to reiterate, anything that I'm sharing with you today or anything that I have that I mentioned, please feel free to email me after the session and ask me for it, and I will get it right out to you. Are there any other questions so far? It looks like we might have one hand up. And actually, I'm not going to take anybody off of mute. So if you have a question, if you could submit it via the questions box, that would be great. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions right now, so I am going to keep moving forward. And again, if you have any questions, just submit them and I'll pause and answer them as we go through. So we've gone through the first 3 steps. Let's move on to the next step of our donor management model, which is engagement. So I think as I mentioned when we talked about planning, too often engagement tends to be something that's kind of in our heads, and we kind of have a sense of, oh, I know I'm supposed to do something with Mr. Jones next week, and then somehow that thing with Mr. Jones always gets pushed off because there were 100 fires that had to be put off, and 2 months later we are kicking ourselves because we missed some major opportunities with Mr. Jones because we didn't do the engagement moves, the engagement strategies that we knew we needed to. When you think about engagement metrics, when you think about what you need to measure, there are a couple of different things that I will say. Think about what your issue is around engagement. Is the issue that you're getting stuck while you're trying to develop engagement opportunities? I think half the battle when we're coming up with engagement opportunities is just thinking of what to do. Thinking of, how do I engage Joe Donor? What should I be doing with him or with Mary Philanthropist? And so one of the metrics you might look at is the number of donor strategy meetings that you're holding per month. Too often we don't take the time to have strategy meetings with our teams. We tend to have management meetings with our teams. We tend to have team meetings that are focused on activities, on tasks, on to-do lists, but we don't tend to have enough strategy meetings, and especially enough donor strategy meetings with our team. So if you find that your team is really getting stuck around just coming up with engagement opportunities, hold yourself accountable to having a certain number of donor strategy meetings every month and monitor your progress on that. And monitor whether or not that's actually making a difference in terms of coming up with strategies. If in fact coming up with ideas is not your issue at all, some of you may be saying, oh no, we know exactly how to engage people. We have great engagement opportunities. We have lots of things lined up, but our problem is that we're not reaching our deadlines. We're not hitting our due dates. We are coming up with great ideas and then not following through, and too many people are falling through the cracks. If that's your issue, then what I would do is I would recommend something like this prospect management report that you see on your screen. And again, this is just an excerpt from our prospect management report we're using. You may be using something similar that you're pulling out of your database, out of Razor's Edge, out of Salesforce, out of whatever it is that you're using, or you may have a separate spreadsheet that you're using. But make sure that you're using it consistently and measure progress toward this prospect management tracker. And I would even go so far as to say that monthly, somebody should be going in and looking at the percentage of timelines and due dates that were met versus not met. And we're going to talk a little bit later about individual frontline fundraiser performance objectives, and I would make the argument, especially if this is a real issue for you, that becomes an individual metric for each of your frontline fundraisers, for each of your relationship managers, is the percentage of due dates met per month for engagement. So again, just a couple of different ways to look at how you might measure engagement with donors. So let's move to ask and close, and I do combine these two steps for our purposes here. I think again, just that it sounds so simple, but I talk to so many nonprofits who say to me, Laurel, I just know we're not getting out there and making the asks. I know it's not happening. We have identified people, we're engaging people, we're doing the right things, but then when it comes time to make the ask, it's just not happening. And so again, I think it seems simplistic, but looking at something as obvious as just how many asks are being made every month, both the total and also by solicitor or by relationship manager, looking at how many are made. And is that enough? You know, this is where you kind of go back to that table of gifts and look at where you are in terms of gifts that need to be closed. Are the number of asks enough to get us to our goal, or do we need to be making more? Now, of course, just making the ask is not enough. We need to know how well we're doing, what our yes rates or what our success rates are in terms of those asks. I think the one that is obvious, the one that a lot of us look at or think of when we think of yes rates, is the percentage of closed gifts to the number of requests made. But I think it's also important to think about looking at things like the percentage of amount received, looking at the actual dollar amount you received versus what you requested, not just the number of gifts. And then also looking at the amount received versus capacity. I think that's another interesting metric to look at. There are times when you purposefully are asking for far less than capacity because this is an introductory gift, or it's a kind of stepping stone ask to a larger gift. But again, I think looking at things like that are helpful. And again, it can also be helpful to look at this by solicitor or by relationship manager, because what you may find is that you have certain people who are phenomenal at this. I think we all have a sense, we can all kind of guess who our best askers are, but if we actually were to look at yes rates by solicitor, I think you might be surprised at who's seeing some real success, and you might find that this is actually a real talent or a real skill for somebody, or that somebody has a really great way of asking and are developing their asking strategies in really great ways. So you can use it as a coaching opportunity for some of your other solicitors. Also looking at it by solicitation method and appeal. Obviously, this is something, when we look at things like direct mail, we like to look at return rates, at yes rates, which appeals are working. Another, we can also be looking at this in terms of events, what different appeals are really working when we're looking at our events. So again, both looking at just the raw total number of asks that we're making, but also looking at the success rates of those asks. I think the other great thing about looking at yes rates is that it helps us to answer questions about other steps in the donor management model, because it may not have anything to do with the ask itself. I think when we start to look at yes rates and we start to see numbers that we don't like as much, it forces us to go back and evaluate, are we not rating enough of our donors? Are we not doing enough research? And is this a case to really try to find more support and more resource around the research function? Or maybe it's that we're not creating enough written donor plans. Maybe we're kind of going off half-cocked and just kind of meeting with people and don't really have a plan for what we're trying to achieve with them. So when we get to the ask, we haven't, even if we've talked to them a lot, we haven't really increased motivations or decreased objections the way we should have during that engagement period, and they're just not ready to say yes. So again, yes rates not only kind of assess our ability to make an ask, but it also assesses all of those steps leading up to the ask. So I think, again, a really powerful metric. I want to talk now about thanking protocol metrics, and you'll notice that I pull thanking separately from stewardship. A lot of times we kind of lump thank with steward. For the purposes of this today, I wanted to pull thanking out separate because I think of the thank process as really more of a protocol issue, making sure that you have acknowledgement protocols in place for thanking people, that you have protocols that say, we will get a thank you letter out within 24 hours, that they will get a thank you call within 48 hours, that every new donor receives a welcome package, all of those things. First and foremost, make sure you have those protocols in place. And secondly, make sure that you are actually doing the things that your protocols lay out. Some of you may have, I don't want to underscore the importance of this step and make it sound completely administrative, because I do want to, just for some of you have heard this statistic, but for those of you who haven't, Penelope Burke, who a lot of you will have heard of, did some pretty landmark research years ago about the impact of donors receiving a thank you call from a board member. And actually, Blackbaud just replicated this research study last year and actually confirmed Penelope Burke's initial findings. And basically, what happened is donors received a thank you phone call from a board member within 24 hours of receiving their gift. So the organization received the gift. Within 24 hours, a board member made a thank you call to that donor. The next time those donors were solicited, they gave on average 39% more than donors who did not receive a phone call. So I'm going to repeat that. The next time they were solicited, they gave 39% more than donors who did not receive a call. And after 14 months, those donors were giving on average 42% more than donors who had not received a call. So, this is one of those things. If you're having challenges with engaging your board members in development, I think stewardship and thanking is a phenomenal way to engage them. And if those numbers don't speak to you in terms of the importance of having a board member make that thank you call, then I'm not sure what will. So, that's something to think about implementing in your organization, and then creating a metric to see, which percentage of donors are receiving that thank you call. And potentially even, doing kind of a micro study within your own organization to replicate Penelope Burke's research to see, what difference is that thank you call making with those donors. So let's talk about stewardship. Stewardship is one of those things I feel like I could talk about all day long. I could do a week-long session and just sit in a room with people and talk about stewardship, because I feel like it is probably the most important work that we do as development professionals. It is the thing that has probably the greatest long-term impact on our bottom line, because we know that retention is critical. Retention is the key piece in making sure that our programs are efficient, because we know that it costs less, and it is far more efficient to retain a donor than to acquire a new one. So, in the beginning, I kind of talked about the fact that there are tons of metrics out there, and that you really should pick metrics that are relevant to you. Don't get swayed by different people out there who will say, I read lots of articles that say things like, these are the 3 most important metrics that you must measure, every organization should be looking at these 2 metrics, and half the time I kind of read those and I think, yeah, that's a pretty important thing, but it's probably not important for everybody. I would make the argument that donor retention is the one metric that I would say is important for everyone. And if you're not measuring it, if you haven't figured out how to get this measured, figure out how to get it measured. It is so key, both in terms of knowing how well you're doing with your donors, how happy your donors are with you, but it's also such an important bottom line number. So in addition to just looking at retention rate, at looking at how many donors give again, I also would encourage you to look at dollars gained and lost from retained and lapsed donors. This is a number we don't tend to look at as much, but can be a powerful number, especially with the board. When you're looking at ways to engage the board in fund development and you want to start with stewardship, this is such a dynamic case to make with them and to be able to show them how many dollars. And I will say that for the most part, I would venture to guess that most of you are losing dollars from lapsed donors every year that you're having to make up with new donors. Is a really powerful case. I will say when it comes to retention rates, you can look at it overall. You could also look at it by program, by activity, by appeal. There's a lot of ways to segment out those numbers. At a very basic rate, you should at least be looking at it by revenue source, so looking at it by individual versus corporate versus foundation. And also I would encourage you to look at first-year donors versus multi-year donors. And the reason I say that is if you look at Blackbaud's Donor-Centrics Index of National Fundraising Performance, what they found, this is from their 2013 data set, for first-year donors, donor retention tends to hover around 27%. But for multi-year donors, for those donors that give more than 1 year, donor retention hovers around 58%. So we have a 31 percentage point difference between first-year donors and multi-year donors. So imagine if we put a lot of focus on donor retention for first-year donors, and we could get our first-year donor retention rate up. Imagine the impact that would then have on our multi-year retention rate, and it could be pretty powerful. So again, measure what you can and be realistic about it, but if you have the ability to look at things and to slice and dice your data in a way that you're able to look at both your overall retention rate as well as retention rate of first year versus multi-year, I think that's something that can be really, really valuable. Again, upgrades is a really great measure of how well you're doing with your donors, how satisfied they are, and pledge fulfillment rate is just another way of kind of looking at retention and upgrades with donors. It's also important, I think, in addition to some of these metrics, I think it's also important to think about adding some process metrics to your scorecard. So things like number of stewardship moves delivered, where you're not just looking at results, but you're looking at your process and measuring your process and setting some goals, setting some benchmarks for your team around how many moves you're going to deliver. And then finally, looking at something qualitative like donor satisfaction, sending out a survey 2 or 3 times a year to donors to gauge qualitatively what their satisfaction level is. So now I want to move on. We kind of talked about the donor management model. We spent most of this call talking about the donor management model, that pillar of the 4-part fund development system. But I do want to touch upon the other 3 parts here in the last 15 minutes or so of our call. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the next pillar of the fund development system is people and performance management. And what does it mean to retain our best people, hold people accountable? And the first thing, I'm going to focus on frontline fundraisers first. And so for many of you, this is your major gift officers, this is your development staff. And first and foremost, I hope that everyone has in place performance objectives. I say that kind of, hoping that most of you are kind of like, oh, Laurel, of course we have performance objectives in place. The reality is I work with a lot of organizations across the country, and not very many do. I think a lot of shops have revenue goals. that they need to meet. I think they have deadlines that they need to meet. I think they have a sense of how they're going to do it. They have a calendar maybe in place. Maybe they have a plan in place, but not enough organizations have taken that next step of really creating a performance management system and having performance objectives in place. So if you're one of those organizations that doesn't have performance objectives in place, I want to encourage you to do so. I want to encourage you to take the time to really think through what it is you're trying to achieve and what that means for each person's performance. So, and again, like we talked about with the Fund Development Plan, I think first and foremost, your metrics as it relates to performance of your people should be rooted in the Fund Development Plan and should be rooted in performance objectives. If you have performance objectives in place, don't go and add a bunch of metrics. Have them in the performance objective, have it grounded within that. Some things you might consider. Again, I would imagine that for a lot of you, your performance objectives have things like, again, revenue, expectations, activity, task expectations. I would, encourage you to look at additional metrics like the number of prospects that are assigned. What's your portfolio size? And what's the diversity of that portfolio? Is it a good balance, a good mix of new donors, mid-term donors, long-term donors? Number of visits per month, setting expectation around that, number of stewardship moves delivered. Again, a combination of results-focused metrics along with process metrics I think is really important. I think also, as we talked about those different metrics related to the donor management model, many of those metrics can be measured on an individual contributor basis. So again, look through those metrics and see, should we be looking at donor retention by major gift officer or by relationship manager? Again, should we be looking at yes rates by relationship manager? And these can be some of the metrics that we use to measure the performance of our frontline fundraisers. Now, of course, CEOs are also part of our fund development team, so we don't want to leave them out when it comes to setting some strategies and setting some metrics for them. I think these are just a few. Again, CEOs can be held to many of the same metrics that we talked about for frontline fundraisers, especially in smaller shops. Your CEOs may carry their own portfolio, so they should also or can also be held to the same metrics expectations around their portfolios as everyone else is. But also you can look at things like percentage of their time that they spend on fund development, the number of touches they have, numbers of hours per week they spend working directly with the CDO. What I like about setting metrics like these for the CEO is it really helps you to start understanding how much of the CEO's time is dedicated to fund development versus how much time you wish was dedicated. I think I talk to a lot of CEOs who I very rarely talk to a CEO who says they feel like they're spending as much time as they should on fund development. I almost always talk, or that they're doing the things they would like to be doing with that time. I think I almost always talk to CEOs who wish they had more time. And I think measuring this, being able to measure that time is really helpful because it helps you identify, are there some systems or processes that we need to put in place to help our CEO be more effective with the time they have to dedicate to fund development? And also, if our CEO can't dedicate the time that they need to fund development, what is it that's taking up other parts of time, and does this become a case to make to the board or a case in terms of budget allocation to have resources for those other areas? So, do you need to hire a CFO, or do you need to get additional administrative support for the CEO that will free them up to be able to do fund development? So again, something important to look at. Another key part of our team when it comes to development is volunteer leadership. Again, this is the third pillar of our fund development system, and we should set some metrics around it. I'm going to focus here on board. I think that's the thing we tend to think about the most when we think about volunteer leadership. We tend to think about the board. That tends to be our biggest segment of volunteer leadership. Some of you have very robust volunteer structures outside of the board. You have auxiliary groups, you may have event committees, young professionals groups, other groups of volunteers that help you in the fundraising process. I think for the most part, this doesn't tend to be a big enough part of our program that we're going to look at setting specific measurements for it. But if for you it is a big enough part, then use these board metrics as a guide. You can use some of these metrics as a guide for setting goals for some of those other committees or volunteer leaders within your organization. Again, I think board giving is something we tend to look at pretty standardly across the sector, but how many of us are looking at the percentage of board that are giving at the leadership or major gift level? Or what percentage of board members are giving at capacity? I think that we've gotten to a point, thankfully, it's taken a long time, but I think we've gotten to a point in the sector where most organizations I talk to are pretty close to 100% board giving. I think this was not the case even 10 years ago. But now I think it's become such an expectation that we're pretty much there. Measuring board giving seems almost irrelevant at this point. But I think most people would agree that they don't think their board members are giving what they could. And if someone's on your board, I hope that you are at least in the top 3 of their giving priorities, and looking at things like how many of them are giving at the leadership or major gift level, or how many of them are giving at capacity, helps you get to that issue. So I think that's really important. And then it's also important to look at how engaged the board is in fund development activities and how big of a role they play in your fund development program, because they should be playing a big role. So looking at things like the amount raised from and by the board as a percentage of the annual fund, and looking at the percentage of members that are actively involved in helping secure major and principal gifts is really important to get a sense of how big is their role, how significant of a role is the board playing in our fund development success. And if it's not big enough, what are we going to do to change it? Because they should be, along with your development staff and your CEO, they are the third partner in that transformational partnership that's really going to make you have incredible fund development success. Finally, I want to talk about that 4th pillar, which is systems and technology. I want to talk a little bit about some overall program effectiveness metrics. Again, I didn't include here things like progress toward revenue goals. I figure that's something that you all focus on enough already, and I wanted to focus on something else today. But looking at things like cost per dollar raised, there's a lot of benchmarks out there. Wealth Engine has some great tools. James Greenfield has really great research in terms of suggested guidelines for cost per dollar raised. But looking at that for both overall as well as for your different appeals, your different solicitations, and your different activities, so that you really have a sense of what's effective and what's not effective. Revenue diversification is something I included here, not because I think it's something that you're probably looking at on a day-to-day basis, but I would imagine it's something that you have strategies and goals for in your long-term strategic plan, that over the long term you want to be changing to be less reliant on special events or less reliant on government funding. I would imagine many of you are hoping to increase the amount of revenue that are coming from unrestricted individual donations through leadership and major gifts. So, if that is in fact part of your long-term plan, just make sure that you have strategies in your annual plan that are actually moving the needle on that. I think a lot of times we make plans for that and then cross our fingers and close our eyes and hope that in 3 years we get there, but we're not necessarily actively doing things that are moving that needle. So just make sure that that's included in your plan. And again, staff capacity. I have this next slide I wanted to show you. These are kind of next generation, I would say, maybe 2nd or even 3rd level metrics when it comes to process and program effectiveness. But I wanted to share them with you today because I think they're interesting. And I'm kind of a nerd. If you guys haven't already been able to tell over the last 45, 50 minutes, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to this stuff. And this is something that we had developed a while back, this idea of taking the donor management model and looking at yield rates and processing times throughout the model. So looking at the percentage of prospects that make it from one step to another, that, for example, make it from once you identify donors, what percentage of them actually end up getting a plan? Or what percentage of them actually end up getting an ask made? You may identify 500 prospects in a month, but actually only end up making an ask to 50 of them. And that might tell you something about how well you're identifying people, how well your pipeline management is. It could be telling you things about how effective your research processes are. The other thing I would love to have you think about is this idea of processing time, which is how long is it taking for people to move through this system? So, how long does it take somebody on average from when they're identified to when they have a plan made? And the reason I think this is an interesting metric is because I think a lot of us can think about bottlenecks in our systems, areas where, because we either have a lack of staff functionality, a lack of staff capacity. Maybe it's because staff are least comfortable in this area, so it's the thing that they tend to put off and not focus on. We know that things are getting stuck there. Or, again, as we talked about with engagement, we know we're creating the plans, but then plans aren't getting enacted. So things like processing time and yield rate help us to actually look at where are the bottlenecks in our systems? Where are we falling short in terms of functionality? Where do we need to beef up functionality of our department, of our system, to make sure that we're moving people through this model, we're moving people through this process in an effective way, in a consistent way, and in a quality way. So again, I think these are probably, like I said, second or third level metrics. They're probably not things you're starting out measuring, but I wanted to put them out there for you today because I think they are potentially something really interesting to look at if you know you're having some specific challenges with getting people through the process. And then again, just a quick note about data integrity. If your data isn't clean, if it's not reliable, then none of this matters because none of these metrics are going to mean anything. And so make sure you have some quality assurance checks in place. Make sure that you have updated policies and procedures for your data. So finally, I just want to wrap up by saying, first and foremost, we need to decide on our key metrics, analyze gaps, what's keeping you up at night, figure out which metrics are really going to help you answer those questions and help you achieve your goals. Once you've done that, determine your process for pulling the data regularly. Create timelines, create due dates. Are you going to pull data the second Friday of every month and distribute it? Create a scorecard so that you have an easy-to-use, consistent way of sharing this data across constituencies, so between board members, staff members, executive team, that everyone can see this in a way that makes sense. And then finally, implement regular strategy development sessions. So don't just look at the data, don't just ponder it at your desk by yourself and think, that's interesting. I want you to do something, make those course corrections. The reality is that we talked today about this being a great time of year to make course corrections. But the reality is if we're looking at this data on a monthly, on a weekly, on a regular basis, we don't need to make drastic course corrections twice a year because we're making small corrections throughout the year as it's necessary. So implement a way to do this on a regular basis. We have just 1 minute left. I had hoped to have a little bit more time for questions, but we have just 1 minute left. I don't see that anybody has submitted anything. I hope that means that you're all just so busy pondering how you're going to go back and take this information and implement it in your organizations that you haven't had time to think of questions, or it's a case of what I mentioned earlier is, sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, and we don't know which questions to ask. But I will encourage you all, if you have any questions following up with this, you will get a follow-up email with the PowerPoint and a recording of the session, so please feel free to share this with others in your organization. And please feel free, after you've had a couple of days to ponder this, if you have any questions about, again, thinking through metrics and what to implement in your organizations, I'd be happy to answer questions by email. I'm also happy to share any of the worksheets or templates that I talked about today, table of gifts, capacity rating guidelines, major gift strategy worksheet, prospect management report template. So please just shoot me an email if you're interested in receiving any of these tools. And with that, I want to thank you all very much for taking your time today to join me on this call. I hope you found this useful. As you can tell, it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, really excited about, and hope that you all are more excited about it today than you started out. So join us on our blog, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and call us if